May 14, 1982, Pebble Island, Falklands. The air tastes of salt and aviation kerosene. A man stands at the western edge of a gravel airstrip on an island that does not appear on most maps of the world. He is not yet important to this story. He is a shape in the darkness, a uniform holding a rifle that has gone cold against his palms. The wind is blowing at 30 knots across open grassland, unbroken by a single tree, because there are no trees on Pebble Island. There are no trees anywhere within 800 miles. There is only grass and peat and wind and the permanent bone-deep cold of the South Atlantic in winter. Somewhere to the south, 11 aircraft sit in dispersal revetments along the edge of the runway. They are dark, angular shapes, barely visible against a sky that is only marginally lighter than the ground beneath it. 11 aircraft, 6 Pucarás, 4 Turbo Mentors, 1 Skyvan, $47 million of Argentine air power sitting in the dark on a grass island in the middle of nowhere. The smell drifts across the strip in waves, JP5 aviation fuel mixed with rotting kelp and the permanent salt wind that never stops, not for an hour, not for a minute. The temperature is 3 degrees Celsius. The sentry shifts his weight. His FNFAL rifle is an iron bar against his fingers. Something is wrong. He does not hear a sound so much as he registers the absence of one, a gap in the pattern of wind moving through the tussock grass, as though something has interrupted the flow. He turns. He sees nothing. The darkness is absolute. No moon, no stars through the overcast, no light from the settlement 400 meters east. He stares into the black and the black stares back, and neither of them blinks. Then a single flat crack, not like a rifle shot. More like a branch snapping under a boot, except there are no branches on this island, and there are no boots that should be out there. Then a white flash turns the nearest Pucará into a silhouette for one frozen. Impossible second, the twin turboprop engines, the swept wings, the cockpit canopy all outlined in light that has no business existing at this hour in this place. Then everything happens at once. 40 minutes earlier, 6,000 miles away on a different continent, a man from Fort Bragg, North Carolina, had said this would be impossible. Earlier that day, aboard HMS Hermes, the British aircraft carrier pitching in heavy South Atlantic swells 40 nautical miles north of Pebble Island. The operations room was cramped and low-ceilinged, lit blue-green by radar screens and the glow of plotting tables. It smelled of electrical insulation and reheated coffee, and the deck moved underfoot with the slow, nauseating roll of a 28,000-ton warship in open ocean. Major Charles Rensick, 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta Force, stood at the back of the room and watched the British plan their raid. He was a liaison observer, attached to the task force by quiet arrangement between Whitehall and the Pentagon. He was 36 years old, from Fort Bragg, 3rd Generation Army, West Point class of 68. He had been aboard for 3 days. He had sat through the intelligence briefs. He had reviewed the target folder. He had examined the reconnaissance photographs of the airstrip, the sentry positions, the aircraft revetments. He had run the numbers the way Delta taught him to run numbers: force ratios, suppressive fire requirements, extraction contingencies, communications redundancy. He had a problem with what he was seeing. In the passageway outside the operations room, speaking to a fellow American liaison officer, a Navy commander from the carrier intelligence staff, Rensick said the words that would, by morning, become the most expensive miscalculation of his career. Those Brits are going to paddle a canoe into an airfield guarded by Argentine Marines and blow up fighter planes with plastic explosive, in the dark, without NODs. They won't come back alive. The tone was not contemptuous. That is important. Rensick was not sneering. He was genuinely concerned. He was a professional special operator who had looked at the operational plan and concluded, based on everything he had been trained to believe, that it could not work. The force was too small, the approach was too long, the equipment was too primitive, the margin for error was non-existent. Rensick's unit, Delta Force, was barely 2 years past Operation Eagle Claw, the Iran hostage rescue attempt that had ended with 8 dead Americans and burning helicopters at a desert staging area called Desert One. He knew what happened when special operations went wrong. He had been there. He had watched the RH-53D Sea Stallion helicopters abort in a dust storm. He had watched a C-130 transport and a helicopter collide on a desert runway, turning the staging area into a funeral pyre. 8 men died. The hostages stayed in Tehran. The mission became the foundational trauma of American special operations, the wound that had not yet healed and would not heal for years. That disaster had taught Delta one overwhelming lesson. If you do not have overwhelming support, do not go. More helicopters, more contingency plans, more communication relays, more technology, more of everything that can be stacked between an operator and the randomness of combat. And now, Rensick was watching a force plan the exact opposite of everything that lesson had taught him. He had every reason to believe this would end in failure. By dawn, he would have no reasons left, because by dawn every aircraft on that island would be burning, and the men who lit the fires would be back aboard HMS Hermes, drinking tea and complaining about the biscuits. This is the story of one night in the Falklands War. The night 45 men from 22 Special Air Service walked onto an Argentine airstrip and destroyed 11 aircraft that were scheduled to fly ground attack missions against British troops landing at San Carlos. It is also the story of what an American special operator learned when he watched a force with less technology, less money, and less institutional arrogance accomplish something his own unit. The most expensive special operations force on Earth could not have planned better. To understand why Rensick was worried, you first have to understand what he was comparing them to. If Delta Force had been tasked with destroying the aircraft on Pebble Island, the mission package would have looked nothing like what the SAS was planning. Rensick's mental calculus ran on a different operating system entirely. For a target set of this size, 11 aircraft spread across a 600-meter airstrip, defended by approximately 40 personnel, Delta's planning doctrine in 1982 would have called for a 32-man assault force, organized as 2 troops. Each operator would carry an M16A1 rifle, fitted with a Colt 4x20 scope, and an M203 40mm grenade launcher mounted under the barrel, adding 1 1/3 kilograms to an already heavy weapon. Each man would wear AN/PVS-5 night vision goggles, Generation 2 image intensifiers that cost $3,200 per unit in 1982 money. Each man would carry a sidearm, 4 fragmentation grenades, and individual demolition charges. In addition to the assault force, Delta Doctrine called for an 8-man sniper and overwatch element armed with M21 rifles, dedicated helicopter support from at minimum 4 aircraft, which Delta did not yet reliably have, because the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment was only just forming, real-time radio relay to a command element with aerial observation, and a 45-minute pre-assault bombardment from supporting fires to suppress the garrison before the first operator crossed the start line. The total cost of equipment carried on the ground by the assault force alone would have been approximately $1.2 million, just for the operator's personal kit. This was a force designed to reduce risk through material superiority. Every single piece of equipment existed for one purpose: to make the margin of error wider and the individual operator's exposure to chance narrower. Layer upon layer of technology, redundancy, and firepower, stacked so high that the enemy's ability to influence the outcome shrank to nearly zero. It was, in its own terms, brilliant. It was also the product of a trauma that Rensick carried in his bones. He did not think Delta was unbeatable. He knew it was not. He had been at Desert One, and he carried that knowledge like a stone in his chest. The dust storm they called a haboob that blinded the helicopter pilots. The mechanical failures that reduced 8 helicopters to 5. The collision on the runway that killed 8 men and burned the mission plan to ash. That night had taught Rensick that special operations exist on the thinnest possible edge between success and catastrophe, and the only way to widen that edge was to bring more helicopters, more communications, more contingency, more technology. And now he was watching the SAS plan a raid that violated every one of those principles. The Argentine garrison defending the airstrip was not large, but it was not negligible. Rensick's target analysis identified approximately 40 personnel, pilots and ground crew for the aircraft, plus a marine infantry platoon assigned to perimeter security. They were armed with FNFAL 7.62 2mm rifles, the same caliber the SAS carried, and MAG machine guns in sandbagged positions around the airstrip perimeter. Sentries were posted at 4 compass points around the settlement, rotating on regular schedules. But the garrison had no radar, no night vision equipment, no reinforcement capability. The nearest Argentine unit was at Goose Green, 80 kilometers away across open water, unreachable at night. The aircraft sat in open revetments with no hardened shelters, no minefields, no barbed wire, and no illumination plan. Rensick assessed all of this and still concluded the raid was suicidal. His blind spot was fundamental. He was calculating the odds using Delta's Doctrine, which treated technological parity as a baseline condition for any operation. He could not conceive of a force that treated the absence of technology not as a deficit to be compensated for, but as a tactical feature to be exploited. But the men who were actually going to Pebble Island that night had a different arithmetic. The D Squadron preparation area aboard HMS Hermes was a section of the hangar deck, cleared of aircraft and screened with canvas partitions. On the early afternoon of May 14th, the troopers of 22 SAS D Squadron were laying out their kit on the steel deck plates under fluorescent lighting that buzzed and flickered with the vibration of the ship's engines. Major Rensick walked through. He had been invited to observe the preparation, a courtesy extended to a fellow special operations professional. What he saw confused him. Men were packing Bergen rucksacks with PE4 plastic explosive charges wrapped in green masking tape. L2A2 fragmentation grenades were lined up in neat rows on a ground sheet, 680 grams each, 4-second fuse, 4 to 6 per man. The rifles were L1A1 self-loading rifles, not the compact weapons Rensick had expected, but full-length 7.62 mm battle rifles that weighed 4 1/3 kilograms empty, were loud, had no suppressors, and were older than half the men carrying them. One trooper was taping a silver compass to a loop of paracord so he could hang it around his neck and check his bearing without stopping. Rensick asked about the night vision situation. He was told, politely but without particular interest in his opinion, that the squadron did not have night vision goggles allocated for this operation, and did not want them. The reasoning was delivered by Captain Eldon Mackenzie, D Squadron Troop Commander, 31 years old, 9 years in the regiment, veteran of Oman. Without looking up from the map he was folding into a 6-inch square. "We don't need to see in the dark, sir. We need the dark to not see us." Rensick processed this in silence. In Delta, the absence of night vision goggles would have been a mission abort condition. No positive target identification, increased fratricide risk, navigation errors compounding over distance. In the SAS, it meant lighter load, no battery dependency, no depth perception problems inherent in Generation 2 image intensifiers, and total darkness as an offensive weapon rather than an obstacle. The cost contrast was almost comical. Rensick's AN/PVS-5 goggles cost $3,200. Mackenzie's compass on a lanyard cost roughly £4. The precise loadout for the Pebble Island raiding party was as follows. Each trooper in the assault group carried an L1A1 SLR with 6 loaded 20-round magazines, 120 rounds per man, plus a bandolier of loose ammunition, 4 to 6 L2A2 fragmentation grenades. The demolitions team carried additional PE4 plastic explosive, pre-cut to 200-gram blocks, 4 charges per target aircraft, each fitted with electric detonators and Cortex detonating cord for simultaneous initiation. Staff Sergeant Liam Harkin, 27 years old, from Belfast, former Royal Engineers before SAS selection, was responsible for rigging the charges. He carried 8 kilograms of PE4 in a separate Bergen, plus the initiation set, a Shrike exploder, a hand-cranked electrical detonator, a reel of detonating cord, safety fuse as backup, and electrical firing cable. Harkin carried a brass Zippo lighter that he claimed he had never had to use because, in his words, PE4 comes with its own spark. 2 troopers in the assault group carried M72 light anti-tank weapons, 66mm disposable rockets, single-shot tubes weighing 2.5 kilograms each, effective against static targets at 200 meters. Each one cost £84. They were intended for any aircraft that could not be reached for demolition charges, or for engaging hardened defensive positions. 1 L-42A, 1 bolt-action sniper rifle per troop, fitted with the No. 32 Mark III telescope, for overwatch and precision engagement. 1 PRC-320 high-frequency manpack radio per patrol, carried by the signaller, Corporal Pete Yates, 24, from Swindon, for encrypted communication with HMS Hermes and for calling in naval gunfire from HMS Glamorgan. The County-class destroyer positioned offshore with twin 4.5-inch guns on call. Personal clothing, windproof smock over a woolly pulley, disruptive pattern material trousers, standard issue boots, combat webbing. No body armor. It was not standard issue for the SAS in 1982. And the weight penalty was considered unacceptable for a 12-kilometer round trip on foot across peat bog. No night vision, no GPS, it did not exist for infantry use. No thermal imagers, no drones, no laser designators. The total cost of one SAS trooper's personal kit and weapons for this mission was approximately £400 to £500. A comparable Delta operator's loadout at the time exceeded $14,000. The plan was brutal in its simplicity. Phase 1, 2 Sea King HC, 4 helicopters insert D Squadron 6 kilometers west of the airstrip at 0200 local time. Phase 2, the squadron walks 6 kilometers across peat bog and tussock grass in total darkness. Guided by compass bearings and the reconnaissance data from an SAS boat troop patrol that had been inserted by Klepper folding canoe 2 nights earlier and had been lying in an observation post 800 meters from the airstrip for 36 hours, counting aircraft, logging sentry routines, and identifying defensive positions. Phase 3, at 0700, 45 minutes before first light, the assault troops attack the airstrip from the west, while the fire support group engages the garrison. Naval gunfire is on call. Phase 4, 30 minutes on target. Destroy all aircraft, withdraw on foot, fly back to HMS Hermes. No contingency helicopter, no alternative extraction plan. If things went wrong, they walked to the coast and waited. 200 hours. They moved. Night of May 14th to 15th, 1982. 2 Sea King HC-4 helicopters lifted off from HMS Hermes at 0130 local time. They flew low, 30 feet above the South Atlantic swell, to stay beneath the detection threshold of Argentine radar on West Falkland. Inside each helicopter, 22 men sat in darkness on canvas bench seats, burden rucksacks on the floor between their boots, SLR muzzles pointed at the ceiling. The cabin smelled of hydraulic fluid and wet wool. Captain Mackenzie sat nearest the starboard door. He had folded his map into that 6-inch square, showing only the landing zone and the route east. His last words to the helicopter flight commander, before the ramp closed, were delivered without drama. 30 minutes. If we're not back in 30 minutes, we've either finished or we haven't. And either way, there's nothing you can do about it. Aboard HMS Hermes, Rensick stood in the operations room, watching a map board with the planned route marked in grease pencil. He had a cup of coffee that had gone cold. He had the communications net. He had the ability to listen if the SAS broke radio silence, but he could not see them. Nobody could. 2 helicopters carrying 45 men had disappeared into the South Atlantic darkness, and the next signal would either be mission complete or silence. At 0200, the helicopters touched down on an exposed ridge 6 kilometers west of the airstrip. The ramp dropped. The troopers filed out into a 30-knot wind that hit them like a wall. Temperature, 2 degrees Celsius. Visibility, less than 50 meters. The Sea Kings lifted immediately and vanished south, their rotor noise swallowed by the wind within seconds. 45 men began moving in single file across peat bog in total darkness. No lights, no night vision. Each man navigated by keeping visual contact with the Bergen of the man in front, a technique the regiment called caterpillar movement, requiring iron discipline and acute spatial awareness. The ground underfoot was waterlogged peat, spongy, giving 6 inches with every step. Boot prints filled instantly with black water that reflected nothing. The wind was a constant physical force pressing against the left side of the body. The tussock grass, head height in places, thick as a wall, whipped across faces and snagged on webbing straps and rifle slings. Every man was soaked through within 20 minutes. The 6-kilometer tab took 90 minutes. Slow, deliberate, silent. At 0345, the lead scout made contact with the boat troop observation post. 4 men had been lying in a scrape cut into the peat for 36 hours, wrapped in hessian and tussock grass, watching the airstrip through a telescope. Their report was delivered in a whisper. 11 aircraft, confirmed, sentry positions unchanged from the last update. Garrison appears to be sleeping, except for 2 roving sentries on a predictable circuit. At 0400, the squadron split into its operational elements. The assault troop moved south toward the airstrip. The fire support group set up on a low ridge 300 meters north, with the sniper rifle and the radio. Corporal Yates began the encrypted procedure to bring HMS Glamorgan's 4.5-inch guns online, confirming the pre-plotted fire missions that would isolate the garrison buildings from the airstrip. Aboard HMS Hermes, Rensick checked his watch. He had heard nothing on the high-frequency net. Radio silence was standard SAS procedure. They would not transmit until the assault began, or until they aborted. Every minute of silence was either proof that the plan was working, or proof that something had gone catastrophically wrong. There was absolutely no way to distinguish between the two. The assault troop made its final approach in pairs, low-crawling the last 200 meters through tussock grass, using the wind noise as natural sound suppression. The airstrip was directly ahead. The pucaras were visible now, dark angular shapes against the pale gravel, parked in a staggered line along the southern taxiway. Each aircraft sat approximately 40 meters from the next. Harkin began moving down the line, PE-4 charges in his Bergen, Cortex reel paying out behind him as he worked. Here is the detail that matters most, and it is the one Rensick could never have calculated from the operations room aboard HMS Hermes. The SAS reconnaissance patrol had not just counted aircraft, they had timed the sentries' walking routes. They knew that at 0410, both roving guards would be at the eastern end of the airstrip simultaneously, facing away from the assault axis, for a window of exactly 90 seconds. The entire plan, 45 men, 11 targets, the naval gunfire plot, the withdrawal route, had been built around a 90-second gap in a sentry's walking pattern. That was the SAS's night vision equivalent. That was the technology that cost nothing and could not be jammed. 0415. Harkin is rigging the 3rd pucara when a door opens in the settlement 400 meters east. Light spills across the gravel like a wound in the darkness. An Argentine marine steps out, probably heading for the latrine, and stops. He is looking directly at the airstrip. He sees something. Maybe the shape of a man crouching where there should only be the angular shadow of a wing. Maybe a shadow that moves against the wind instead of with it. Something that does not belong. He shouts. One word, Spanish. It carries on the wind. Mackenzie's voice on the intra-patrol radio is flat and immediate. Go loud. The sniper on the ridge fires first. The L-42A1 cracks once, a sharp, thin sound that the wind swallows before the echo can form. The Marine in the doorway drops. Then the fire support group opens up. 3 SLRs firing rapid single shots into the settlement buildings. 7.62mm rounds punching through corrugated iron walls like cardboard. Tracer rounds sketch orange lines across the darkness, arcing flat and fast. And Harkin, who has 3 aircraft rigged and 8 still to go, begins working faster. This is the moment the operation splits into 2 simultaneous events happening in the same physical space, but operating on completely different timescales. The firefight is measured in heartbeats. The demolition job is measured in minutes. The SAS needs both to happen at the same time, and neither can wait for the other. What happens in the next 20 minutes rewrites the relationship between American and British special operations for a generation. The airstrip erupts. Harkin detonates the first 3 charges simultaneously. The PE-4 goes off with a flat percussive thump that compresses the air outward in a visible shockwave, not the cinematic fireball of a movie explosion, but a white flash and a wall of pressure that collapses the cockpit canopies of 3 Pucarás inward, like crushed aluminum cans. For 1/2 second, the entire western end of the airstrip is lit in harsh, surgical white. Then the aviation fuel in the wing tanks catches. Now the fireball comes, a rolling orange column that climbs 30 meters and lights the entire airstrip in flickering industrial light. Shadows leap and dance across the gravel. The darkness is gone. The assault troopers move down the line. The 4th and 5th Pucarás take M72 rockets, the disposable 84-pound tubes, fired from 30 meters. Each rocket punches through the thin aluminum fuselage skin and detonates inside the airframe, blowing the engine nacelles apart in a spray of turbine blades and structural tubing. The 6th Pucará receives a double charge of PE-4 placed precisely on the wing route where the fuel lines run. When it detonates, the fuel ignites instantly and the aircraft splits along its centerline as though unzipped. Harkin's voice on the radio, flat as a weather report. 6 down, moving to secondary line. The secondary line, 4 turbo Mentors and 1 short Skyvan, parked farther east along the strip. The assault troopers reach them at a run, placing charges while the fire support group on the ridge keeps Argentine heads down with sustained methodical rifle fire, not spraying, not suppressing with volume, but placing aimed shots through specific windows and door frames to keep specific defenders from reaching specific firing positions. The turbo Mentors are smaller and lighter than the Pucarás. Each one takes 2 PE-4 charges and dies with a sound like a filing cabinet being dropped from a rooftop, a crunching metallic collapse that is more destruction than explosion. The Skyvan, larger and more stubborn, takes a LA rocket through the open cargo door and a P-4 charge on the port engine nacelle. It burns slowly, the corrugated fuselage skin peeling away in sheets like burning paper, revealing the skeleton of the airframe beneath. Naval gunfire arrives. HMS Glamorgan's 4.5-inch shells, each one weighing 25 kilograms, begin impacting east of the airstrip between the burning aircraft and the settlement buildings. The signaller on the ridge is calling corrections, drop 50, right 50, fire for effect. The shells detonate in a line of percussive flashes that carve a beaten zone across the open ground, a wall of shrapnel and blast pressure that no human being can cross and survive. The garrison is isolated. No Argentine counterattack can reach the airstrip. The Argentine Marines try anyway. 5 men emerge from a building at the eastern edge of the settlement, firing FNFLs from the hip as they run toward the burning aircraft. The fire support group engages. Within 20 seconds, 2 Argentines are down and the remaining 3 pull back inside the building. They do not come out again. Total time from Mackenzie's "Go loud" to the last aircraft burning, 22 minutes. 8 less than he had promised. 11 aircraft destroyed, 6 Pucarás, 4 turbo Mentors, 1 Skyvan. Estimated replacement value, $47 million. Destroyed by a force carrying approximately 18,000 pounds worth of weapons and explosives, moving on foot across ground that was supposed to be impassable. SAS casualties, 2 wounded by shrapnel. 1 from a secondary explosion when a Pucarás ammunition cooked off, 1 from a fragment ricocheting off a revetment wall. Neither man required evacuation. Both walked out under their own power. Argentine casualties, 2 killed, several wounded, the remainder pinned inside settlement buildings by naval gunfire and SAS suppressive fire until long after the last British soldier had vanished back into the darkness. Mackenzie ordered the withdrawal at 0437. The squadron pulled back along the same route they had come in on, moving northwest across the same peat bog that had soaked them on the approach, toward the helicopter pickup point. Behind them, the airstrip was a line of individual fires, each one marking a dead aircraft, the flames reflecting off the low overcast and visible from 20 kilometers out to sea. The Sea Kings arrived at 052 and extracted the squadron without incident. Aboard HMS Hermes, the runner reached the operations room at 0545, with the preliminary result: 11 aircraft destroyed, 2 minor casualties, mission complete. Rensick, the American who had said they would not come back alive, was standing at the back of the operations room when the count came through. By the account of the SAS officers present, he did not say anything for approximately 40 seconds. Then he asked for a cup of tea. First time anyone aboard that ship had seen an American drink tea voluntarily. Mackenzie's after-action report, submitted that afternoon, was 4 pages long. It described the approach, the assault, the demolition sequence, and the withdrawal in clean, factual prose. It did not mention bravery. It did not mention heroism. It described a job done to specification, in the allotted time. 11 aircraft, 22 minutes. $47 million of Argentine air power erased by men carrying compasses on lanyards and plastic explosive wrapped in masking tape. The Pucarás on Pebble Island had been scheduled to fly ground attack sorties against the British landings at San Carlos Water 6 days later. Each Pucará carried 2 20mm cannon and 4 7.62 mm machine guns. They would have strafed landing craft, logistics ships, and troop concentrations packed onto the open beaches of the beachhead. Every one of those aircraft was now a charred skeleton on a gravel strip on an island most people in the world had never heard of. The men who burned them were drinking tea and complaining about the biscuits. The Pebble Island raid entered the curriculum at Fort Bragg within 18 months, not as a historical anecdote, not as a war story to be told over drinks, as a formal operational case study in economy of force. Rensick, who returned to Delta Force after the Falklands War ended, is credited in this account with writing one of the first internal assessments comparing Delta's force structure assumptions with what the SAS had demonstrated in a single night on a windswept island in the south. Atlantic, his core observation was simple and devastating. Delta was designing missions to eliminate risk through technology and mass. The SAS was designing missions to exploit simplicity and speed. Both approaches could work, but the SAS approach worked in conditions where Delta's could not because it depended on fewer external variables. No helicopters to break down in a dust storm, no electronics to be jammed, no batteries to die at the worst possible moment, no supply chain to fail. The SAS approach asked more of the individual operator and less of the system that supported him, and that made it resilient in ways that institutional mass could never replicate. By 1987, the creation of the United States Special Operations Command, the unified structure that would eventually oversee all American Special Operations Forces, would formalize many of the inter-service and international lessons of the early 1980s. The Falklands after-action reports, including observations from American liaison personnel aboard the task force, contributed to the institutional recognition that special operations required dedicated command structures, smaller footprint capability, and doctrinal flexibility that could not be achieved under conventional military bureaucracy. The Argentine military response was immediate and telling. Within 48 hours of the Pebble Island raid, all remaining forward-deployed Argentine aircraft on the Falkland Islands were either withdrawn to the mainland or relocated to the hardened airbase at Stanley. The strategy of dispersed forward basing on outlying islands, which had placed the Pucarás within striking range of the anticipated British landing beaches, was abandoned permanently. One night's work by 45 men had reshaped the entire Argentine air campaign. And then there are the voices of the men who were on the receiving end. Teniente Primer Emilio Bardi, Pucara pilot, stationed at Pebble Island, described it this way: "It was over before we understood it had begun. The first explosion, we thought it was naval bombardment. Then we saw men moving between the aircraft, and each aircraft died in sequence, like someone was turning off lights in a corridor. There was no hesitation in their movement. They knew exactly where to place the charges. They knew exactly how long they had. We were trained to fight an amphibious assault, hundreds of men coming off landing craft. What arrived instead was a small group that moved like shadows and destroyed everything we had in less time than it takes to eat breakfast." Capitan de Fragata Diego Molina, garrison commander at Pebble Island, gave his account after the war. "We trained to defend against a battalion. They sent a handful. We never considered that a handful could be enough. Our defensive plan was designed around the assumption that an attack on the airstrip would come with armored vehicles, or at minimum a company-strength infantry force supported by helicopters. Instead, they came on foot, in the dark, through terrain we considered impassable at night. By the time we organized a response, there was nothing left to defend." An Argentine Marine non-commissioned officer, captured and debriefed after the war, said, "Those men didn't fight like soldiers. Soldiers advance and take cover. These ones moved like they already knew where we were, where we would go, and exactly how long each of us would hesitate. The ones placing the explosives, they were working while we were shooting at them. They didn't stop. They didn't take cover behind the aircraft. They placed their charges and moved to the next one as if the gunfire was not relevant to them." The relationship between Delta Force and 22 SAS, already built on mutual respect through exchange programs and shared training, deepened in the years after the Falklands. By the late 1980s, joint exercises between the two units became routine, ranging across Belize, Brunei, and joint counter-terrorism scenarios in the United Kingdom and the United States. The Pebble Island operation was studied not as an anomaly, but as a template, proof that there existed a category of mission where simplicity was not a limitation, but a weapon. Rensick, in this account, retired from Delta Force in 1991 as a lieutenant colonel. He is said to have kept a framed photograph in his office at Fort Bragg, a grainy image of the Pebble Island airstrip taken from a Royal Air Force reconnaissance flight the day after the raid, showing 11 black scorch marks on the gravel where the aircraft had stood. Each scorch mark was roughly the size and shape of the aircraft that had burned there, 11 dark silhouettes on a pale strip, a photograph of absence. Mackenzie remained in the regiment until 1989, completing tours in Northern Ireland and the Middle East. He never commented publicly on the raid. Harkin stayed in for 22 years. His brass Zippo lighter, the one he said he had never had to use, was eventually gifted to the Regimental Museum in Hereford. There is a doctrine that says the answer to every problem is more technology, more equipment, more layers of capability, more money spent to widen the margin between an operator and the chaos of combat. And sometimes that doctrine is correct. But there is another doctrine, older, quieter, and infinitely harder to teach, that says the answer to every problem is a man who has been trained until the technology becomes irrelevant. A man who can navigate by compass when the satellite signals are jammed. A man who can fight without night vision because he learned to read darkness the way most people read a printed page. A man who can destroy $47 million of aircraft with 18,000 pounds of explosive and walk out carrying his wounded. That is what 22 SAS does. That is what Pebble Island proved. That is why you do not bet against the regiment. If this is the kind of story that changes how you think about warfare, the stories that never make the front page, the operations that reshape doctrine in quiet rooms at Fort Bragg and Hereford and Poole, then subscribe. This channel exists to find them, and there are more, many more. Somewhere in a museum in Hereford, there is a brass Zippo lighter sitting in a glass case. Its owner carried it for 22 years and never once had to strike it. PE4 comes with its own spark.